Al Capone, the man behind the St. Valentine's Day massacre. He crystallized the hypocrisy of the time. Even before the massacre, he represented the frightening grip that crime had throughout America. To Capone, it was just business.
Al Capone said many times, "Don't blame me. I'm only supplying what the demand is." And the demand was great, not only in Chicago, in every place in the United States.
To America, Capone's open reign of crime embodied the hopelessness of enforcing prohibition. But in Chicago, Capone was thought of very differently. To many, he had been a Robin Hood, a gentleman, a philanthropist. He had brought money and excitement to the city.
To every place, as long any place in Chicago, he ruled that. No, he could sell whiskey to the post office. He didn't care, beer and everything, because he ruled town, and he had to do what he wanted to do.
He brought jazz greats from New Orleans, like Louis Armstrong, King Oliver, and Duke Ellington. Lucille Zinman would go to hear the jazz at Capone's speakeasies.
Any nightclub you went to, you saw Al with about 2 other men and 3 women at the table. And very often the women were women that you knew from the show who had made a date with Al Capone. He was a very fair-skinned Italian with impeccable dress, and he was very much of a gentleman in that capacity.
Everything was okay then. Plenty of work, plenty of money, plenty of girls, plenty of this, plenty of that. And everybody was happy.
Under Prohibition, Capone united Chicago. Like him, the city had 2 distinct faces. It was built on the frontier between civilization and the wilderness. It brought together urban corruption and Wild West lawlessness. It was a city steeped in blood, built around the slaughterhouses. Its business was butchery. Many believe Prohibition created the mob, but in this city, gangsters ruled long before. Walter Trohan was a journalist in Chicago.
Chicago had crime before Prohibition. I remember as a young boy, a few blocks from my grandmother, a fellow died named Moss Enright, with a revolver in one hand and a rosary in the other. That was well before Prohibition. But when Prohibition came, the gangsters found a new source of revenue.
These gangsters had divided Chicago. The city's immigrant populations huddled together in clearly defined ethnic areas: Italian, Irish, Polish, Jewish. The gangs defended their own racial territories. It was Prohibition which allowed Capone to break the mold. When he started his own operation, it was not in Little Italy, but where the alcohol ban was most keenly felt. He chose Cicero, an industrial suburb where 30,000 beer-drinking Germans lived. With his brothers Ralph and Frank, he ruled by intimidation and fear from his headquarters at the Hawthorne Inn. On local polling day, Capone put gunmen on the roofs of Cicero, forcing voters to elect the weak and wet officials already on his payroll. By 1924, Cicero had 100 saloons and 150 casinos, all controlled by Capone and his henchmen. His rule over Cicero was absolute. But one man dared to speak out against him, a young newspaper editor called Robert St. John.
My newspaper was dedicated to driving Scarface Al Capone out of Cicero. As I was going to my office early one morning, a big black touring car came roaring up. The car screeched to a stop. 4 men jumped out. At first I didn't know whether they were plainclothes detectives or gangsters, but I then recognized Ralph Capone as one of them, and so I knew. I fell to the ground and curled myself up in a ball because I knew what was about to happen.
St. John suffered a bloody beating.
I was some days in the hospital. When I went to pay my bill, the hospital cashier said, "Oh, your bill was paid this morning." And I said, "Oh, that can't be. Who paid it?" She said, "A man came in, and I said, 'Describe the man.' Well, she said the only thing that was unusual about him is he had a scar on his left cheek. Of course, it was Scarface Al Capone. He had paid my bill."
Violence and charity, Capone's double game. What he could not intimidate, he would buy. When St. John persisted, Capone bought the Cicero Tribune. He left its editor only one option.
I gathered up a few things from my desk, and I put on my hat and coat, and I left my office, never to return. I've never been back to Cicero since.
By 1924, the suburb of Cicero had been bought. Capone now headed into Chicago. Prohibition had been devised to impose cultural unity on the immigrant population, but it was Capone and the illegal liquor trade which really brought them together.
Al Capone especially worked very hard to break out of narrow ethnic boundaries and to build a political coalition that reached across ethnic boundaries. So he formed liaisons with Jewish gangsters, with Irish gangsters, with Polish gangsters, and with black gangsters. This was very unusual. In fact, this was unprecedented in American history. By building this coalition, which was in effect a political coalition, he was able to amplify his power a great deal.
Capone drew his gang without prejudice from all the immigrant communities. Prohibition had made alcohol the #1 criminal earner. There were low fines for being caught and high rewards for getting it through. The competition between racketeers and bootleggers to control the liquor trade was heated. Openly defying the law, their armed liquor trucks drove across the country and through each other's territories. The Sicilian Jenner brothers even paid the police to escort their liquor trucks. When the Irish O'Banion gang hijacked the Jenner brothers' convoy, they sparked off a bloodbath. Shootings, murders, and retaliations. They called it the Beer Wars. Capone's multi-ethnic gang was able to divide and rule, side with the winners, and set each gang against each other. There were 136 gangland killings in the first 5 years of Prohibition. There was only one conviction.
You must remember that at that time, the state government, the county government, the city government, all governments, local governments were under the control of Al Capone and his mob. They could not get convictions. You couldn't get juries that were brave enough to stand up to these people. Witnesses were subpoenaed, were appear, and they were murdered. Big problem in those days was staying alive, keeping the prosecutor alive as well as the witnesses.
Prohibition had corrupted the law. It was authority's way to control its citizens. But in Chicago, it was Capone who controlled authority. Walter Trohan was on a story when he visited one of Chicago's police station houses.
I went up to the stairway and I was frisked by 2 men who halted me, took me, and felt to see if I had any revolvers, and I was indignant. I was a reporter. I was an important person, in my own opinion. And I went to the police captain and protested at the Harrisons. I said, "You're goons," I guess, words to that effect, frisked me as I was going up to the station. And the captain looked at me and said, "Those weren't my men. Those were Capone's bodyguards," which was an astounding thing to me, and I reported it. The fact that Capone not only went into the station, but his bodyguards frisked everybody who went up to be sure they weren't carrying a gun to shoot Capone.
Capone faced many assassination attempts. He always got away. By 1926, Capone had manipulated the Prohibition law, the gangs, and the police. All that was left was public opinion. He rarely let photographers take the scarred side of his face. The Prohibition Act had proved that a good image was a great cover for bad behavior. Prohibition made Capone an emperor. He ruled from his new palace, the Metropole Hotel in central Chicago. A little Caesar, his reign over the city had crossed national divides. It conquered and united disparate European communities. Prohibition had elevated Capone to wealth and respect. The outlawing of alcohol had taken him to the top. Just as Ford made Detroit, Capone made Chicago. He ate the industrialist. He employed the city.
When I came to Chicago, I had only $40 in my pocket. I went into business that was open and didn't do anybody any harm. Hundreds of young men, thanks to me, are getting from $150 to $200 a week.
He would go about in public and people would cheer, their benevolent city father. They would happily wave at the murderer. Capone courted their support. Tony Berardi covered the races for the Chicago Evening News.
Now, I used to like to bet a few dollars on a horse. And Al Capone and his bodyguards are walking by. And he says, "Hey, kid, how you doing?" I said, "I'm doing okay," because I made a few dollars. He says, "Why don't you bet on number 6? Now, I'm a racing form horse bettor. I looked at the racing form, and the horse that he mentioned, he only mentioned it by number. I looked at him, and he was a steeple horse. I said, "Oh, my God, how the hell can he win this race?" Well, in a horse race language, he opened up at 99 to 1, and then he was going down, and he went down to about 60 to 1, and one of his bodyguards stuck a ticket in my pocket and walked away. I look at the ticket, and it's $5 win ticket on this number 6. Sure enough, number 6 won by a half a block. Paid. Well, I got $322 for my for that $5.
He may have controlled the racetrack, but Capone wanted much more. Even as he was killing rivals on the streets, he was buying his most expensive status symbol, a new mayor, his mayor, Bill Thompson.
Al Capone spent $250,000 on Big Bill Thompson's second mayoral campaign. It was probably the best money that Capone ever spent because it bought him a great deal of political support and protection. Once Big Bill Thompson became mayor for his second term, he disappeared. He went hunting in Michigan and wasn't seen or heard from for months on end. So in effect, there was really nobody to run Chicago during this era except for the gangsters.
Thompson did little to mask his own anti-prohibition sympathies. He was even elected on a promise to be wetter than the Atlantic Ocean.
When Thompson died, they opened a safety deposit box and they found $2 million in cash in bills in the safety deposit. This money was obviously illegitimate. It came from corrupt sources or sources buying favors or receiving favors, such as the bringing alcohol into the loop by the Capone mob.
With the mayor under Capone's thumb, Chicago was completely clutched in the fist of the mob. 1928, the beer wars had resulted in 367 murders and 115 bombs in the city. But in the following year, the violence would culminate in a massacre which even shocked Chicago. It rocked America.
About 10 o'clock that morning, which was Valentine's Day, 1929, I believe, I got a call and told me to go to 2122 something North Clark Street. Well, as I got there was a police officer in front, and he was not going to let me in, and I just shoved my way in. I got on top of I don't know, I'll call it a truck or whatever it was, and shot down pictures down, and then I got off of this truck and made about a half a dozen different photographs of these bodies.
They had been shot, there's half a dozen of them lying there, some of them with their heads, top of their head blown off. A river of blood, really, a terrific amount, let's put it that way. And a wild shepherd dog, German shepherd, going crazy at the end of a chain, lunging at anybody and everybody. Very curious thing, it became a sideshow in Chicago. Every reporter in town, virtually, came there to look at it. Most of the politicians came to take a look at it. The place, the parade of people, and there was this lineup of corpses in a tangle and in a mess. It was not a pleasant sight.
7 bullet-riddled bodies, Bugs Moran's henchmen. They had tried to hijack one of Capone's liquor trucks. Jack Machine Gun McGurn, Capone's right-hand man, had shown Chicago exactly who was the boss.
Willis O'Rourke of the Chicago Evening American went in and looked it over and came out, looked down at his feet, and said, "I got more brains on my feet than I have in my head," which I remember because it was an apt remark, gruesome but apt. And also, the Evening American that evening carried a great line, "Chicago gangsters graduated from killings to massacres," which was true.
With the St. Valentine's Day massacre, the whole of America woke up to the true face of Prohibition. The newspapers, with their stark pictures, crystallized Chicago's entire bloody history into an instant of horror. Millions of Americans realized that Prohibition had created Al Capone, that he was the man behind the massacre. The feelings against him and Prohibition intensified.